Hello, everybody, and welcome to Classroom Psychology. I'm your host, Cora. Thank you so very, very much for joining me. It's wonderful to see you, as always. And I hope you're doing well. Grab yourself a drink, pull up a chair, and let's see if we can't think about gender diversity some more. And this week, much like we do every time we come together, we take a public confident statement from a public figure or a famous book author or a politician, or in this case, an influencer, rather famous influencer, maybe even notorious. And we take their publicly declared statements for the questions we're sure they're intended to be. And we're going to take his for the question which sure is intended to be a question. And we'll see if we can't answer it together, often by reviewing the scientific literature. But today, again, we're going to amazingly have the opportunity to interview an expert in the field about masculinity. And we'll see if we can't find an answer to Andrew Tate's question. So here is, content warning, Andrew Tate, as he's known to do, speaks in rather direct terms about our community. So here is, deep breath, everyone, Andrew Tate.
Well, I am actually genuinely concerned by the fact that I've been banned from schools when I do nothing but preach masculine strength and excellence. But then if you actually understand how the society is going and how the world works and all the insanity they're trying to push on all of us, I can understand why they banned me, because I speak the truth. If I was wearing a wig, Piers, and lipstick and telling young boys to remove their genitals, would I have been banned from schools? No. They would have said, no, you can say his name, no problem. No matter how big I got, if I had a wig on and lipstick and I had been castrated medically, I would be allowed to talk to the young boys. But as soon as I say you're supposed to grow up and get big and strong, and if your wife doesn't want a job, you need to pay for her, it's your job as a man, you better find some money, then I'm the public enemy number one. Garbage.
Thanks so very much to Andrew Tate for such an interesting question posed, as they often are, in the form of pretty confident declaration. Oh, this one took a deep breath, everyone. But we'll take it for the question we're sure is intended to be. We'll see if we can't find an answer together. And we're going to talk about masculinity. You know, when we talk about gender and gender diversity, we also need to talk about, what is masculinity and what is the kind of masculinity that Andrew Tate is sort of talking about here. And that he generally kind of might represent a kind of masculinity that's quite powerful, that might reinforce the kind of hegemonic masculine power structures, perhaps even that feeds into and benefits from patriarchal power norms. Oh, it sounds like a really challenging topic, but thankfully we have the absolutely wonderful Dr. Ffion Davies to talk to us about her research. She's conducted systematic review, a meta-analysis in this field, and her own empirical research. So there really is, I can't think of anyone I would rather spend an hour with talking about this topic. And I'm so very glad that you get the opportunity to meet her too. So this is the wonderful Dr. Ffion Davies. Hello, Ffion. Thanks so very much. Dr. Davies, thanks very much for giving up some time to talk to us about your work, as fascinating as it absolutely is. And hey, congratulations as well on your article getting out in EdSci, I think.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here. And yeah, thanks for reading my article as well.
Hey, I think it's making waves. I think, apart from anything else, it comes at a good time, because I think we're in the throes of a sort of kind of light masculinity revolution, as people start to question it. Is that your sense?
Yeah, I think so. And I was sort of reflecting recently about, this as a general topic, and then I think I saw somewhere on it was Instagram, so it wasn't a reliable source, but I think there's something that they've just passed about certain types of misogyny being now classed as like a terrorist
yes, I saw that yesterday, right?
Yeah, so I haven't read it yet, but that seems that we're going in the right direction, and it was kind of something I'd been reflecting on recently, and so I feel like yeah, it's good. We're going in the right direction. And because the prevent program or thing that we all do safeguarding training on if you work in
Sure, sure, sure.
education. And it talks about radicalization, and obviously that's been in the news quite a lot recently about terrorism and radicalization. And I feel like the type of radicalization we actually see in schools is about the really misogynistic views, the Andrew Tates of the world, incels, and that doesn't actually seem to be included on the prevent training. And so I think that was something that needs to be added. So then this news coming out about it maybe actually being classed as a terrorist kind of act is really good, I think. But yeah, it's also disappointing and sad that we're in this situation, but good that something is happening about it, I think.
I think that's fast. I mean, it was interesting that you bring up like Andrew Tate seems to be everywhere. I was in the pub like just not that long ago, and I remember us like in the next booth over, there was a guy, talking in quite heavily misogynistic terms, and we were like, gosh, this guy's partner, and as we were leaving, took a quick gander, and it was like an adolescent kid and his mum, and I was like, oh my goodness, whew. And he was just talking very in liberal terms about Andrew Tate, like, I mean, like liberally, just misogyny. So for people at home who don't know who Andrew Tate is, what this is like all in reference to, who is he and why is this important right now?
So Andrew Tate is just a public figure that he, got really big on social media. And he was just sort of espousing really misogynistic views about women and, sort of promoting women's place as being in the home and misogyny in terms of, men's power over women and those kind of things. And then, so he made a lot of noise on social media and he became really popular on Twitter, on, I think in Instagram, all those kind of places, and had a lot of followings of young men and boys. And I think even some, grown up men. And so he's actually now, I think, been arrested and maybe charged with human trafficking. So,
oh, wow.
I mean, yeah, so make of that what you will. But so I think he's less prevalent now, but I think the discussion that he started is definitely continued. And obviously because of algorithms and how the internet works, the more you see of that on your social media, the more you're going to see. And so I think for young boys, the really difficult part is that if you like pay attention to those things, it's just going to flood your feed so much. And then you don't see any other opposing views. And as a young person, it's hard to know, which role models you should listen to. And so I think he became a role model for some people. And yeah, so I think obviously a very problematic role model, but definitely a role model. And yeah, I think it's sort of, I think it's reached Parliament and everything. They've talked about Andrew Tate in like the British Parliament. And so teachers are concerned about it. And yeah, it's just quite concerning. Not just him, but everything that's kind of been discussed.
That's fascinating. So the sort of the social change that we have seen has reached Parliament. And given how slow Parliament is to react to social change, like it's a big social change. So do you have a sense of what the context is that, like, what's the gap that somebody like Andrew Tate fills for young people? Like,
yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think, and also I think it relates to incels as well, because I don't know about Andrew Tate, and I think it's about community and something like this. So, because obviously incels are a group of people who identify themselves as involuntarily celibate. And so they've made a lot of noise on sort of social media, Reddit and 4chan, those kind of things. And those communities have reached up to 40,000 people. And so I think that is giving a community, but they also, talk about the misogyny and the hatred of women, and incels have even been sort of linked to actual murders in the US and in the UK. So the Plymouth shooting was an incel. And so that's really dangerous. But I think for young men, it's kind of giving this community, and they kind of relate all the things that have happened in their life that have gone wrong. They blame it on women. So I guess it's kind of giving them that scapegoat, maybe, that, it's easier to blame other people for things that have happened in your life rather than self-reflect, maybe.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
I remember reading, I can't remember the theorist. I don't think it was a theorist, it's an author who wrote about the cloak of violence. This idea that that men become like the social norms for masculine sort of social connection are so poor. Like there's no opportunity for kind of physical touch, no opportunity for social support and connection and care and public displays of affection or love. And so so men can engage in sort of physical sport and sometimes violent sport as an opportunity to then get like the social care that comes with that. Like boxers winning a bout instantly get the care and love from each other, and they look after each other, and they get. So do you get a, like, I don't know if this is a reasonable question, but is incel culture to some extent a sort of example of that?
Yeah, I think I've never heard of that before, and it makes a lot of sense, because all you have to do is watch a football match, which is, kind of coded as really masculine, but I think I see more men cry about football than they do about their own kind of like, things that are actually happening in their own lives. So yeah, I think incels are definitely giving that kind of community, and they kind of build each other up because they all like agree on the same topics. And so that's probably giving them some kind of, affirmation from each other. And I guess what else incels kind of give, and, what gap it fills is that, on I guess a lighter note, is that it must be really hard to be a boy or a guy right now, because, your gender has had power for, 200,000 years. And then you're born into a world where people have started questioning that. And that must be kind of annoying. So I don't know if that has something to do with it as well, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I was watching a trans guy on TikTok who had transitioned, and he was in tears because he was saying, he had no idea, but that entering into a masculine world, all of the kind of closeness and physical connection and care that he had received as, when the world saw him as a girl, he lost suddenly in a world that now saw him as a boy, and entering into all the masculine norms that prohibited that. I think he felt lonely. And I wonder whether that context is a context in which incel culture makes sense, right? Young men feeling alone.
Yeah, definitely. And I think because it's on social media, it's on the internet, where typically you're probably at home on your own, but looking at these kind of websites and channels. So yeah, it must be about loneliness as well, I think. And that's like, belonging is a fundamental human need. And so it's hard not to be motivated by it, I think.
Yes. Yeah. Gosh, fundamental human need for sure. Yeah, absolutely. So that context then, is that what drew you? Why this field? Because you did empirical research, systematic review in this field. What is that? What kind of drew you to it? Why this field?
I know. Well, yeah, that is a massive sort of motivation for me. And I guess I'm a feminist, like a very proud feminist. And so, but for me, feminism isn't about just, ensuring that women have the rights that they do, but it's about the kind of equality for all genders, including men. And we know that they have, power and status because of the patriarchy that we live in. But like you said, there's also drawbacks and difficulties of being a man or a boy in this world. And so, yeah, it's kind of looking at the patriarchy and how it affects everyone. And I do, feel quite strongly about men. And obviously they have a really high suicide rate because there's no help-seeking behaviors, and there's a lot of barriers to that. And I think that's a really big problem in our society. So that was a big motivation. I think it's just such an interesting field, and there were so many kind of areas I could have looked at, but this just kind of drew me into it, I guess. Yeah.
It's benefits you being part of it. I guess, like in terms of educational psychology trainings, like it's pretty female dominated.
Yeah.
So, like, there's a real gap in somebody stepping into thinking about masculinity. I quite like the idea that that feminism is not just about sort of trying to create equality for women, but it's also about evidencing, like drawing people's attention to the problems for men of kind of hegemony, and that it's lonely at the top, that it's hard to find help, that there must be a kind of toxicity to the positivity and strength and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
That's fascinating to me.
Yeah, me too. And there's so much going on, I think, and sort of unpicking it and kind of just understanding the psychology behind masculinity in general is fascinating. And I think it actually helps in like everyday life as well. It makes a lot of sense. Like you said, when I overhear people talking about Andrew Tate in the pub or something, it's to know like where it comes from, like the psychology behind it is also helpful to not always come at people with kind of anger, because I think it's very easy if you're a woman to hear people speak like that and just be angry about it, which is totally valid. But I think sometimes the way to kind of actually challenge those kind of thoughts is in a bit more subtle way. Challenging them head on is probably not going to work because of cognitive dissonance and things like that. But so we have to understand it to be able to challenge it, I think.
Yeah. So when you talk about masculinity, my temptation is to think of like the Andrew Tate kind of form of masculinity as like a hegemonic masculinity. But I know when we emailed and I was like, talk about hegemonic masculinity, you're like, well, maybe we need to talk about language. I was like, totally legit. Okay. So talk me through it. Like, what is hegemonic masculinity a kind of masculinity, or is this a problem of masculinity more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, to talk about masculinity, this is just the question: do we need to talk about gender first, like before we kind of jump into actually talking about the masculinity of it all?
Sounds good to me. Hey,
just so that we're all on the same page.
Yeah,
and sure. I know you've talked about this in your previous like episodes, but obviously we're kind of differentiating here. When we talk about masculinity, we're talking about gender expression, and that is obviously very different to gender identity. So gender identity is what we know we are inside, how we feel, and that's things like whether you identify as a man, woman, all the other gender identities. And then gender expression is, there's also lots of different gender expressions, but that is more of a choice about how we choose to perform our gender to other people. And those are choices like how we dress and what color we paint our bedroom when we're kids, those kind of things. So when we're talking about masculinity in my research, and I guess today we're talking about this expression rather than identity. And so we know that there's kind of a spectrum of gender expressions, from masculinity, femininity, androgyny, gender neutral, non-conforming, conforming. But so we're talking mostly about masculinity, and then also femininity, because people often kind of put them as opposites, which I don't know if that's probably, I wouldn't really agree with that they're opposites, but society kind of tells us that they are. And that's probably a topic for another day, is talking about whether they're opposites or not. But so we kind of know gender expressions are really related to societal norms. I think that's really important when we talk about this today. And what we consider kind of masculine, like changes as society changes. So like a good example is that, high heels were invented for men originally in the 10th century, whereas now it's kind of a more feminine kind of expression. And pink, I think, was a masculine color. So that's just interesting that it changes. So in answer to your question, like hegemonic masculinity is also a construct that kind of changes as society does, but it's a kind of fancy word for whatever masculinity is the most dominant in society today.
Right.
So it will change over the years, the decades, but for now, I guess in our society at the moment, it's things like the stereotypical masculine traits like adventure and risk and aggression, even to some extent. and not showing emotions, like you said. So that's the kind of what the scientific literature calls hegemonic masculinity. But some people don't like that term. And like you said, there's obviously other terms that have kind of cropped up in social media, that kind of thing. And that's things like toxic masculinity and fragile masculinity. And so we have definitions for them, but some people don't like them and some people do. But I do think it's helpful to differentiate between what is toxic masculinity and just masculinity in general, because there's loads of different ways to express your masculinity. And obviously not all of them are toxic. So yeah, I think it's important. Language is important. I agree.
So toxic masculinity, fragile masculinity, hegemonic masculinity.
Yeah.
Not everybody agrees with the terms, and they change over time as a consequence of like culture and cultural understanding. So when we're talking about like Andrew Tate and the kind of misogynistic type of masculinity, that's an extreme form of what kind, or is it kind of a mix?
Yeah, I would say that's the extreme kind of form. And so toxic masculinity is kind of when these stereotypical traits become problematic,
right,
or socially destructive. So that's things like homophobia and misogyny, and that's like what you said, the Andrew Tate kind of promotes. And then fragile masculinity is interesting, and it's kind of related to a theory called the precarious manhood theory, and it's the idea that masculinity must be socially proven, and so it's quite easily threatened. So we might come back to precarious manhood theory, but I think you could also say that Andrew Tate's form of masculinity is also quite fragile, because to express these really misogynistic views, it's probably likely because someone has threatened your masculinity. So you feel like you need to prove it by doing the complete extreme attitudes and behaviors associated with the kind of stereotypical masculinity.
Right. I guess in that position, you're going to be threatened a lot because it's so extreme. Sort of those views are kind of niche and a little bit, they're going to be challenged fairly frequently. I can see how people would need to defend it. Like it's a sort of cognitive dissonance. You mentioned that sort of, well, if people are challenging it, I have to kind of entrench my position to keep it defended and to maintain it. It's a cool. Okay. So we have this kind of gender expression of masculinity that like most gender expression of masculinity is kind of welcome in the world, and it sometimes becomes problematic for people when it enters into this kind of fragile or toxic or hegemonic space. So how do we define that bit? What characterizes that kind of masculinity or those kinds of masculinity? If I was to be in a room and be like, somebody was exhibiting a touch of that masculinity, how would I be like, oh, that's, that's a bit of toxic masculinity there, as opposed to sort of like, oh, that masculinity is probably not so harmful to the person.
Yeah, I think that's the extreme misogyny and the extreme homophobia and aggression. I think, saying that men have to exert their power over other people by being aggressive. I think those are the like socially destructive traits, I guess,
that's interesting. So interesting that homophobia finds its way into there. So is that, because you mentioned like it's a sort of, there's a misogyny and anti-woman kind of sentiment. Does homophobia kind of get looped into that? Because is it like, how does homophobia fit?
Yeah. So homophobia fits in because, and this was something that we kind of looked at in my research, is that so there's a big anti-femininity to masculinity. So proving your masculinity is about proving that you're not feminine, and for some reason homosexuality is often incorrectly kind of conflated with femininity. So it's kind of lumped into the same attitude, really, that to prove your masculinity you have to prove that you're not feminine, and so you have to prove that you're not homosexual, because for some reason they see it as the same thing. And for some reason being feminine is really bad, and in their eyes. And so they kind of see it as the same thing, and that's where the homophobia comes from. There's a good quote in a study where it says, it's not about having a fear of gay men. It's about being perceived as insufficiently masculine. So I think often homophobia is less about sexuality and more about gender.
Wow. Oh gosh, that's so interesting.
Yeah.
It's less about sexuality and more about gender. Fascinating.
Yeah.
Fascinating. So, like, you mentioned your research drew in the linking this sort of slightly toxic masculinity, slightly toxic to very toxic, but that's the things, masculinity, this sort of form of masculinity that's kind of anti-femininity to homophobia.
Yeah.
So what did you look at in your research? You don't mind my asking?
So we did two sort of papers. So we did a systematic review and meta-analysis, and that kind of looked at the how adolescent peer groups police masculinity through homophobic name calling. So the link between masculinity and homophobic name calling. And then the empirical study was looking at a proposed link between fragile masculinity and narcissism, and how it might work in the same way to lead to this homophobic name calling that we see in adolescent peer groups.
That makes really heavily about homophobia and homophobic name calling. So the actual acts of homophobia rather than just kind of attitudes.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. So can we start then with the systematic review that you created? Can you talk us through it? It sounds super interesting. Homophobic name calling and the sort of what influences it, what informs homophobic name calling.
So it's so we found that there was a link between kind of masculinity and homophobic name calling, and this is mostly related to the kind of policing of gender norms within peer groups. So they use homophobic name calling to kind of ostracize or punish boys who aren't conforming to the kind of stereotypical masculine standards. And so when I was in school, it was kind of things like if a boy wore pink or watched a girly TV show, they would say, that's so gay, when wearing pink has actually nothing to do with your sexuality. It's more about your gender expression. So they use it as a way to police gender rather than sexuality.
Right.
Obviously, sometimes it is about sexuality, but the idea that it's banter or like a joke in a peer group is about policing gender. So that was kind of what we looked at and what we found. We kind of found that there were two functions of homophobic name calling. One was this policing of gender as a joke or a banter, and the other one was direct homophobic bullying. And obviously both are rooted in that need to kind of police masculine norms in the peer group, and both are obviously harmful to sexually diverse young people, regardless of whether that's directed at them or not. But there were some really kind of interesting findings in the studies that we looked at, in that, peer group name calling could predict an individual's use of name calling 6 months later. It tended to be friends with you tended to be friends with other people with similar levels of homophobic name calling. It was mostly used by and towards boys, so it's kind of a uniquely masculine peer group kind of thing that happens. It was usually targeted at friends rather than strangers. And interestingly, a lot of the research said that boys didn't perceive themselves to be homophobic while they were doing it. That was quite interesting, that it's their perception of it is like it's a joke, but actually, as we know, it's harmful.
And it has that kind of, by the sounds of things, quite an insidious influence that it affected individuals' use of homophobic name calling in the future, like how they'd experienced it before.
Because I think it was creating group norms of how you speak to each other and how you meant to police each other in this kind of friendship group. But obviously, sometimes it was kind of directly homophobic bullying, because whether it was the boundaries of the joke went too far or whether it was targeted is difficult to know from the research, but I think it probably could be both.
Makes sense. It sounds like a something of a pipeline. Like you can see how these things can start, because if you've got a friendship group and you're internalizing the kind of masculine norms of your culture, and the internalizing that bit of like fragility or hegemony, and then start bantering to kind of that ends up reinforcing the same hegemony, and then it grows and grows into the because it, as other people in the group see it happen and it changes group norms, then they do it more in other friendship groups. You could see how it kind of could grow into something problematic.
Yeah, definitely. And I think because adolescent time is a really important time for identity formation, and it really depends on the identity of your friends. So if your friends are doing it, you're more likely to do it. And then like you said, if it starts in one friendship group in a school, it could spread pretty quickly. And so I think that's what we kind of see in real life at the moment, is that toxic masculinity kind of is a problem in some schools and not in others. And maybe it's because of that, because it kind of spreads through the cultural norms of the school.
Interesting. And it must be very difficult for anybody to challenge it. I was thinking, like, in school staff, we have quite a female bias in teacher staff. It must be tricky for women generally to challenge this in boys, right? Because how do you, like, I would imagine, so maybe I'm a bit out there, but I would imagine that male teachers have an opportunity to model masculine norms that are different to the ones that young people are exhibiting.
Yeah, because we know that if you challenge it directly, it's going to threaten their masculinity, which will then probably entrench these views even more. So
right. Especially if it's a woman challenging it because of the power structures that...
Yeah, exactly. Right. So, I mean, some of the ways that you would kind of challenge it, I suppose, like you said, it's role models, modeling it. I think it's the typical kind of social psychology things that we know about in-group versus out-group kind of mentality, that because peer groups are, especially in secondary schools, it's so much about who's in your friendship group and who's not, and how you identify with your friendship group. So it's those kind of things about how we can increase kind of understanding for the out-group and reduce the like polarizing of in-group versus out-group. So that's increasing empathy as well, I think, for the out-group. I think empathy is a big one of how, that was what we found in this literature, was that empathy is a protective factor.
Oh, really?
So I think that's a good way to start, at least.
That's interesting. So people, is that kind of like a trait level empathy? So people who were more empathic were less likely to like engage in the behaviors that could be harmful, or was it that the behaviors that could be harmful sort of deteriorated people's empathy?
I think in the systematic review, it's kind of hard to know how they measured empathy in those studies, but it just kind of came up as a theme in those studies. And then in my empirical study, empathy was a bit more of a bigger factor. And that was kind of, if you're naturally more empathic, then it's a protective factor. But I also think there's ways that we can induce empathy in people that, so if it's not a natural trait that they have, maybe there's ways you can increase it in people that would help equally.
That sounds like a super important point. I don't know if you're going to be able to answer this question. Who are they empathizing with, these young people? Is it boys who exhibit greater levels of femininity? Is it trying to detach sexuality from gender in their minds, which is less about empathy, I suppose? Or is it about like them having greater empathy for femininity and for women so that their sense of femininity as being a negative thing is deteriorated? That was a complicated question.
I think it's all of the above. We need empathy for, because like you said, if it's femininity they don't like, then that's probably something we should target. But I think the easier way to target it would probably be just increasing empathy for the LGBT community. And then maybe because the studies found that boys didn't perceive themselves to be homophobic, maybe kind of highlighting how it, even if they don't perceive it to be, their words and their actions have an impact on other people, and increasing that kind of empathy would probably be easier than deconstructing the whole patriarchy, like to stop them from doing it. But Also, we should be doing that.
Deconstruct patriarchy.
Yeah.
Step one on our to-do list.
Yeah. But that's a bit much to ask individual schools, maybe.
I mean, I don't even know how you, because I guess I was talking to somebody very recently about physical education, and we were talking about like one of the challenges that that girls face and young women in school and colleges is that femininity is often not seen as very athletic, and athleticism is often seen as quite masculine because of the hegemonic masculinity, and that's kind of how hegemonic masculinity works, I think, is that it kind of says, well, if something is powerful, then it kind of must be masculine, and if something is masculine, then it is probably powerful, right?
Yeah. And I think it even goes further than that, that masculinity is good and femininity is bad.
Wow.
So I remember when I was in secondary school, a PE teacher said, stop running like a girl. I was like, but I am a girl. And also, why is that a bad thing? I was like, have you seen the Olympics? Girls run really fast.
Yeah.
But it was more, and like, so this thing of saying you look like a girl or you act like a girl, it was like an insult.
Yes.
So it's almost like femininity equals bad, masculinity equals good, like that basic. So yeah, I think athleticism, winning things in sports is good. So it couldn't possibly be related to girls and women.
Right. So it's like, it's so fundamental. I suppose it makes sense of why we don't see a sort of hegemonic femininity, right?
Yeah.
There's no equivalent for girls because, or is there?
Well, this was something I've been thinking. I have no like evidence of this. This is just something I've been thinking about recently because I was like, is there a toxic femininity? And then it kind of led me down the path of pick-me girls. Have you heard of pick-me girls?
I have not.
Okay, so pick-me girls is that kind of trend that goes around social media about the type of girls and women who it's the kind of, they put down other women for being feminine. So, for example, even Taylor Swift could technically have been in this kind of realm, I guess, with her song. What is this song? It's You Belong With Me or something is one of her songs. And so in that, she says she wears short skirts, I wear sneakers, or something like that. Or she wears high heels, I wear sneakers. So in that kind of, she's saying that, well, she's bad because she dresses feminine and I'm good because I dress masculine. And so it's kind of, even like girls and women are told that femininity is bad, and to be good or to be liked by boys and men, you have to kind of be different and you have to not be like the other girls, is the kind of trope, I'm not like other girls is the trope that we see so much. So it's kind of internalized misogyny even. It's like we're even siding with the patriarchy when we do that, when we put down other women for being too feminine. And I think it's not as prevalent now. I mean, I think that Taylor Swift song was like one of her very early songs. So I really hope the Swifties don't come for me for saying that.
Get in the comments, Swifties. Defend Taylor Swift. I think Taylor Swift's in enough trouble right now that I don't think anybody's jumping to her defense.
That's true. Yeah. But so it's interesting is that it was like I think toxic femininity is when you're competing and putting each other down. Whereas I think now there's more like female empowerment and we build each other up more. I hope anyway. Maybe that's just our little confirmation bubble. But yeah, so I think there is a toxic femininity, but it's not studied as much, I guess.
Yeah. And it's interesting because it sort of is still, if it is the case, it's still sort of evidence of the same kind of power structure of masculinity versus femininity that people kind of trying to ally themselves in masculinity because masculinity is seen as better. For sure. Yeah.
It's still just internalized misogyny, which I think we all had. Because how could we not when we were told, don't run like a girl?
Yeah.
And it's like those messages that they get so early on. It's like, how can you not have this internalized misogyny if we live in a patriarchal society? I think it's just always going to happen. Sadly.
Yes. Yes, gosh. Yeah. Deep breath, everyone. We'll get that.
And then I think the Barbie movie has kind of done really well to just call all of this out. I think it's refreshing and it's really helpful in terms of it has started the conversation about the patriarchy, and now everybody knows what it is, so we can talk about it.
Yes. Yeah. We have a shared language to describe it.
Yeah.
I do like that. For sure. For sure. There's so many things in my head I want to ask about, but I want to make sure that we get a chance to talk about your system, your empirical paper, because the thing that struck me was when we were talking about empathy and masculinity, and that one of the things that we can do is to try to imbue people with greater empathy for each other, which I guess actually the Barbie movie could be about in a way. Like it sort of talks about the problems of being Ken in a world where you have too much power and are too isolated and are in competition with each other constantly instead of together and feeling alone, and women who constantly feel like they're being measured against standards they can never achieve and having to meet competing standards just to survive in a world, and constantly being said that they're not as good as men. Like, that's kind of perfect. It sort of describes, it doesn't help anybody, any of this. But the thing that struck me that you mentioned is that maybe one of the cures to this is empathy, and your empirical paper was sort of about narcissism, you mentioned.
Yeah.
And narcissism is kind of, to some extent, a failure of empathy, right? Where people aren't attending to anybody else. So talk me through it. Like, how does narcissism play a role here?
So I came across this really randomly, because it was quite early on in the research of like deciding what my thesis was going to be, and I was down this rabbit hole of like masculinity. And then I listened to a talk by Claire Hart, who is narcissism queen. She's amazing, like incredible researcher. And so I was listening to her talk about narcissism, and I was like, oh my God, this is so much like fragile masculinity. There's so many similarities. So, for example, both kind of require maintenance to sustain this desired self-concept, because narcissists are really easily threatened, and so as we know, is masculinity. And both have really fragile self-esteem, so easily threatened and really vulnerable to negative feedback. And both have an avoidance or lack of empathy. So, like you said, narcissists kind of just have a lack of it, whereas in masculinity, it's kind of avoided because empathy is considered to be a feminine emotion. Yeah.
I'm just going to have to give me a minute. Wow.
Yeah.
So empathy is seen as feminine and therefore is avoided in these kind of self-reinforcing circles of masculinity.
So if you threaten someone's masculinity, it increases sort of aggression and homophobia and misogyny, and decreases empathy because it's seen as feminine. So we have to, the anti-femininity rule must avoid at all costs. So they're motivated to avoid it, basically.
God, it's so interesting because it so loops into what we've been talking about like boys feeling increasingly isolated in masculine circles.
Yeah.
Because empathy, it's got to be like the root of all care, right?
Yeah.
How do you care for people? How do you show love if you can't empathize with them? And if empathy and the demonstration of empathy is seen as a feminine trait that we want to kind of eliminate out of masculine circles, gosh, maybe that is one of the reasons why men feel so lonely.
Yeah, I think so. It has to be, because empathy is such a human need, isn't it? We need to feel connected to each other and show care. And so you take that away and who knows we know what the consequences are. It's not good.
Fascinating. So your empirical paper, super interesting. I'm so sorry. I got so excited. So then narcissism and masculinity look a bit similar to each other then, you were saying?
Yeah. So the other similarities is kind of the fear of the undesired self. Like, as we know, narcissism is about fearing the undesired self, and masculinity is about fearing being perceived as insufficiently masculine.
So and fear of the undesired self. Sorry, I have to talk me through that. So what's the undesired self?
So narcissism is kind of because we kind of think of it as being characterized by really, grandiose sense of self. They think they're amazing, and they're really arrogant, those kind of things. But it's actually, they're so worried about being perceived by other people as not amazing, that's kind of what drives their motivation, I think.
Wow.
And yeah, so it's similar to masculinity in that they're so worried about being perceived as feminine that they do the opposite.
Right. So in narcissism, so it isn't necessarily that people think of themselves as grandiose, but just that they're afraid of how people might perceive them, that they act in ways that are self-aggrandizing to avoid that.
Exactly.
Super. So that does make sense of why that's sort of similar to masculinity, that people like exactly what you saw in your systematic review, that people protect against the fear of being seen as feminine.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that is that if you threaten both narcissists and people who kind of have this fragile masculinity, is that they both react with aggression when they're threatened, because they're spending so much mental energy trying to sustain this desired self-concept that they can be aggressive if they are threatened. And so in narcissism, this has been found pretty consistently to lead to bullying. So that's why narcissists kind of bully. And as we know, fragile masculinity, they might use homophobic name calling or homophobic bullying.
Wow. Wow. Gosh. So what does this mean then if narcissism and masculinity are like, they behave in similar ways?
Yeah.
Is masculinity a form of narcissism? Is that too much?
I'm not really sure where the kind of line is, because obviously this was kind of a novel idea and there wasn't much literature behind it. So it's kind of just theoretical at the moment. But I think it's not a form of narcissism. I think it just functions in the same way. But I think that might be wrong. I think it'd be interesting in future research to, see if they correlate, see if narcissism and fragile masculinity happen at the same time with the same people. That would be interesting. But at the moment, I'm just thinking it functions in the same way, maybe.
Okay. That I'm still helpful, I guess, because can we learn something from the field of narcissism then? Is there a way that people like attend to narcissism that we haven't yet done with masculinity that might help?
I think it's, again, about empathy. I think it's about inducing empathy I think that's what they do with narcissists. And so that's definitely where my empirical study kind of led us to, is that empathy is a big factor in it. And so it can be a big protective factor. And especially because in, masculinity, empathy is kind of has the twofold. It's, it's suppressed because it's seen as feminine. And just spending so much cognitive resources on maintaining your desired self-concept is going to reduce the cognitive resources you have to show empathy. So I think it's like we need to double down on the empathy because it's double down in that kind of process, I guess.
So I got two different reasons why, and they're both so powerful. If we're seeing that masculinity, those forms of masculinity that or masculinity on the whole sees femininity as less good, and maybe it's not just masculinity. We all see femininity as less good because of patriarchy, and so what then that feeds into in masculine circles is that empathy is bad because empathy is seen as feminine. Is there a way for us to teach people a masculine form of empathy?
That's interesting. Yeah, I guess I hope so. I don't know what the answer to that is actually at the moment, but I guess it's kind of developing a more inclusive form of masculinity and showing that, showing empathy is a good thing and it is, masculine, but I don't really know how we would do that. I think that'd be interesting one to look into further. Like, how can we reframe it as masculine to show empathy? I'm being drawn to football because I feel like men show so much emotion around football. And I don't know, maybe it's about role models again, and you know, starting where they're at in terms of where it is comfortable to show emotion. Like, how can we extend that to showing empathy as well?
So, what about empathy is seen as feminine? Why is it because it's kind of an act of care, act of nurturing that's seen as kind of maternal almost?
I think so. I think it's about, the care is seen as feminine, and I guess showing empathy is kind of showing a vulnerability as well, because it's an emotion, I guess, and it's quite a deep emotion, and you have to really, I think you have to be quite in tune with your own emotions to be able to share in someone else's. So I think it must be about that. I think it's emotion, and nurture is just seen as feminine, I guess, but rightly or wrongly.
Yeah, I was thinking, interesting to think that showing empathy is also an act of vulnerability that might be difficult for people who are trying to kind of maintain their sense of their like masculine superiority, to kind of to be vulnerable and to reach out to somebody is not just an act of highlighting their vulnerability, but it's also an act of your vulnerability.
Yeah. And you're at risk of opening up the conversation, right? If you show empathy towards someone, if you're a guy and you show empathy towards your guy friend and they are vulnerable back to you, I don't know if that makes you uncomfortable if you're not used to it, maybe. So
what do you do? Like what do you do then? Now you've got to manage the emotions, which I guess is a set of, that's the thing, right? I will say that in my own transition, one of the first things I really noticed was how appalling my skills were in emotional relationships with people. I'm better at it now, but when I first transitioned, I would have people, women physically touch me on the arm or something as just the lightest of things that women do with each other, and I was just flinching at the contact because I had no idea what I was supposed to do with it or how to reciprocate, or and I wouldn't. I just wouldn't go near it. And, in countless other ways where people would suddenly start talking to me about their lives. And I'd be like, I don't know what I do with that, or how to reach out to people, or how to be in relationship. And I was known for a long time as the person who was just appalling at maintaining relationships because I just don't know how to do it. And I think I feel for the guys in the world, who don't get to experience what it's like to be a girl in the world, because I got to tell you, guys in the audience, reach out to people because it's real nice. The few things is quite as nice as that, as kind of affirming and as sustaining as that.
I think and again, it's kind of like a social norm, isn't it? That women all warm and fuzzy, I guess, is the stereotype. But it is kind of my favorite thing about being a woman, is that we all talk about our feelings and we say we love each other, and it's amazing. And then I do feel for men, and especially teenage boys who don't get to do all of that, because it's so important and it's so good for you. We know it's so good for you. It's scientifically proven to talking about your feelings and emotions is really healthy.
Yeah.
So it must be hard, and we know it's hard because of the consequences of it, I suppose.
Yeah. And it's a kind of looping back around to where we started. It sort of makes sense. Belonging is a fundamental human need. Young guys feeling isolated and only finding community, even if it's toxic, meets a need that might otherwise be unmet.
Yeah, and I think I keep coming back to football and sports, but that's why I think it's so important for men to have a sports team, or because that's the only time that they can really connect in maybe the same way with the community and the belonging and the you can show your emotions at football because it's kind of removed from you, because it's not about you, it's kind of one step away, so I think it's a bit safer for them. I think maybe that's why it's so motivating and why it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, because I think it's filling this gap that women have.
Putting it that way, it's kind of remarkable that we haven't created products and services for men to create. Like, this feels like a huge multi-billion-dollar industry waiting to be created as soon as the norms shift enough.
Yeah, and that's why it's so good when football players are, they're getting better at, advocating for mental health and things, and it's really good. But yeah, I think they're just like, men don't need community and health services because they have football, and it's like, no, no.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So it's become a bit of a tradition on the podcast to ask, because we often have young people listening to the show. The viewership stats, actually, there's quite a lot of young people that listen, quite a lot of people from all kinds of age ranges, but and a lot of them are not even from the UK. Even like 74% of the listenership is from the UK right now. So we got people from around the world, often quite young people, and often looking for, like, I don't know what people are looking for, but community, apart from anything else. So, if you were to be able to give a message to the young people listening, what would it be?
I think for boys and men, actually, but mostly boys, it's okay to be vulnerable and show your emotions. It's a societal norm and the patriarchy that stops you from being able to talk about it. But showing emotions, crying, that kind of thing, firstly, shouldn't be seen as a feminine thing, but it is. So firstly, there's nothing wrong with femininity, but also crying doesn't take away from your masculinity. And you don't always have to prove your masculinity to anyone. It's about how you feel inside that, like, really matters, not how other people view you. So if you want to express your masculinity, then that's great. Buy the perfume marketed towards men, or, shop in the men's section of ASOS or whatever. But you don't have to adhere to every stereotype of that emotion, of that gender. It's still valid to express some feminine, some masculine. And you can choose the expressions that make you feel good, and preferably ones that don't hurt others. So, our gender expressions don't have to be so stereotypical. The important thing is that it's unique to you, and it's about what makes you feel good, not what society tells you have to do. So, boys, talk about your feelings, go to therapy, and just look after each other.
That's a beautiful message. Absolutely. Hey, guys out there listening or watching, hey, of course, be the kind of man that you want to be, and know that masculinity can include reaching out to each other, showing care, and making a world where everyone can find a place to belong. Yeah. Be the change you want to see. I love that message. I think it's gorgeous.
And deconstruct the patriarchy.
Deconstruct the patriarchy. What a message. Hell yeah. Join us. Let's tear down the patriarchy. Brilliant. Thank you so very much for joining us. And may I say that, inhabiting maybe new masculinity and saying, I think you're great. And I really appreciate having the opportunity to spend time with you, and getting the chance to spend time with you with other people here. I think they are going to, I love the idea that they get to hear from you a bit more, because it's one of my favorite things to do, to spend time with you. So no doubt it will be for them too.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been so fun, and it's such a privilege. And to be on your podcast is just great, because it's the change that we want to see in the world. I think what you're doing. So thank you so much.
You're too kind. Thanks so very, 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 5 veries much to Dr. Ffion Davies for giving up her time so generously to talk to us about her research, about masculinity, and about what we can do to try to create a world where, people for whom masculine norms apply, that those folk, like everyone else, can find a way to reach out for help, to share their feelings with each other, to share care and compassion, to empathize with each other, and to ultimately make a world where we can all find a place to belong. Thanks so very much to you too for joining me and being part of our little community. You are exceptionally welcome here. And this is Classroom Psychology. Get out there, share this episode or episodes like it with someone you love. If people out there want to come find us, you can find us at Blue Sky and on X, much to my chagrin, at Classroom Psych. Or you can find us at the University of Southampton. Get in touch and share the podcast with someone you love. If you want to hear more podcast episodes, you can find us at YouTube, or indeed you can always find us on your favorite podcast apps. You'll find Classroom Psychology there, where we review the scientific literature to try and answer your questions about gender diversity. And hey, you are exceptionally welcome here. I'm your host, Cora, and I look forward to seeing you, as always, in the next one.